It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Alistair Thorne laughed as he tipped his crystal tumbler, pouring $300 worth of vintage Scotch over Julianne Thorne's surgical research papers in front of the entire hospital board. The amber liquid pooled on the white pages, blurring the data Julianne had spent 3 years collecting. The scent of peat and expensive oak filled the sterile boardroom, a sharp contrast to the faint smell of antiseptic that usually define the air. "A surgeon who can't follow the hierarchy is just a butcher with a degree," Alistair said, his voice dripping with the effortless arrogance of a man who had never been told no. He leaned back in his executive leather chair, his tailored lab coat pristine, the Thorne family crest embroidered in gold thread over his heart. "You were a vanity project, Julianne. A mistake I'm finally correcting." Julianne didn't flinch. She stood at the foot of the long mahogany table, watching a drop of Scotch roll off the edge of the paper and onto the floor. She felt the weight of the room's gaze. Dr. Harrison Reed sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. He was the chairman of the board, a man who cared more about the hospital's endowment than the petty cruelties of its chief of surgery, but his silence was its own kind of verdict. To Alistair's right, Marcus Thorne smirked. He was Julian's older brother by 2 years and a lifetime of unearned privilege. He reached out, flicking a damp page with a manicured finger. "Don't look so grim, Jules. I'll talk to Dad. Maybe we can find you a nice, quiet desk job in the records department, somewhere you can't disrupt things with your little gadgets." "The tech works, Marcus," Julianne said, her voice calm, a sharp scalpel in a room full of blunt instruments. "The pilot program reduced post-operative complications by 40%. The tech belongs to the hospital," Alistair snapped, slamming his glass onto the table. The ice clinked like a death knell. "And since you are no longer an employee of St. Jude S., your access to the lab is revoked, effective immediately. Security is already clearing out your locker." Julianne glanced toward the corner of the room where Alistair Thorne stood. Her mother's face was a mask of practiced indifference, though her knuckles were white where she gripped her designer handbag. Alistair had spent 30 years being the perfect wife to a titan, learning when to look away. She looked away now, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. "Is that the board's final decision?" Julianne asked, turning her gaze back to Dr. Harrison Reed. The chairman sighed, a sound of weary finality. "Alistair is the chief of surgery, Julianne. If he feels your presence is a liability to the department's cohesion, we must defer to his judgment. The Thorne name is the bedrock of this institution. We cannot have it tarnished by internal insubordination." "I see," Julianne replied. She reached into the pocket of her charcoal gray blazer. The fabric was a high-tech synthetic blend, unbranded and matte, designed to be indistinguishable from wool, but nearly indestructible. It was a prototype from a world Alistair didn't even know existed. Alistair stood, straightening his silk tie. "You've always been the outlier, Julianne. Too much of your mother's sentimentality and not enough of my steel. Leave the badge on the table. You're lucky I'm not stripping your medical license along with your dignity." Julianne didn't move toward the table. Instead, she felt the cool, slim edge of the encrypted device in her pocket. It was a silent $40 million leverage, the patent for the very surgical AI Alistair thought he had just seized. He had signed the release forms months ago, tucked into a stack of routine hospital maintenance contracts he had been too arrogant to read. "I'll leave," Julianne said. She adjusted her cuff, the movement graceful and deliberate. "But I think you'll find that bedrock is less stable than you imagine, Alistair." "Is that a threat?" Marcus laughed, leaning back. "What are you going to do? Start a private practice in a basement?" Julianne didn't answer him. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. The sound of her footsteps was muffled by the thick carpet, but the silence she left behind was heavy. She could feel Alistair's smug satisfaction radiating off him like heat. He thought he had won. He thought he had erased her. She exited the boardroom and moved through the high-ceilinged lobby of Thorne Memorial. Patients and staff scurried past, none of them noticing the woman who had just been exiled from her own legacy. She stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the glass doors hissing shut behind her. She pulled the matte black phone from her pocket and tapped a single command. The screen glowed with a series of complex data streams, all showing the same thing. The Thorne Medical Group's debt was being consolidated. "Sela's," she said when the call connected. "I saw the notification." Sela's Vance's voice was low, vibrating with a tech genius's clinical excitement. "They actually did it. They fired you. Publicly." "In front of Reed and the entire board," Julian said, stepping into the back of a waiting black sedan. The interior smelled of new leather and expensive electronics. Alistair poured Scotch on the residency files. "The man has a flair for the prehistoric," Sela's remarked. "So are we green." Julian looked out the window as the hospital receded in the distance. The massive stone building bore her family name, but it was a hollow shell. "We're green. Execute the buyback of the ambulatory wings debt. I want the foreclosure notices served by the morning of the Founders Gala." "That's only 3 days away, Julian. That's going to be a very expensive party for them." "Good," Julian said, her eyes cold. "I want them to be at their absolute peak when the floor drops out." She ended the call and felt the weight of the device in her hand. For years, she had played the role of the dutiful daughter, the brilliant resident, the quiet observer. She had watched Alistair trade lives for legacy and Marcus trade competence for comfort. She touched the unbranded fabric of her sleeve, a reminder of the empire she had built in the shadows while they were busy polishing their inherited trophies. Alistair thought he had taken her career. He had no idea she was about to take his world. The countdown had begun. 3 days until the Thorne name belonged to the one person they had spent a lifetime trying to break. Julian leaned her head back against the seat and watched the city lights begin to flicker on, each one a small spark in the coming fire. The following morning, the air in the private surgeon's lounge at Thorne Memorial smelled of burnt espresso and the sharp, clinical sting of antiseptic. Julianne Thorne sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, her silhouette framed by the sprawling city she was quietly conquering. She wore a charcoal blazer tailored from a high-tech, unbranded Japanese polymer, a fabric that felt like silk but was stronger than steel. To the casual observer, she looked like a woman who had lost everything. To those who knew how to read the shadows, she looked like a predator waiting for the sun to set. The heavy oak doors swung open. The brass hinges let out a rhythmic groan that Julian had memorized during her residency. Alistair Thorne marched in, his white lab coat starched to a razor's edge, the thorn crest embroidered over his heart in gold thread. Behind him trailed Marcus, looking hungover and smug, and Dr. Harrison Reed, the board chairman, who looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. "You're late, Julian," Alistair said, his voice a low rumble of practiced authority. He didn't look at her. He looked at the reflection of his own signet ring as he tapped it against the marble coffee table. The rhythmic clack-clack-clack echoed through the silent room. "The paperwork is ready," Julian replied, her voice a calm, flat line. She didn't rise to greet him. Marcus snickered, leaning against a mahogany sideboard stocked with vintage Scotch. "Still playing the stoic Jules? You're signing away your medical license in this state. You should at least have the decency to look devastated." He adjusted his Rolex, making sure the light caught the diamonds on the bezel. "I heard you've been spending your time in a shared workspace downtown, from chief resident to... What is it? A tech startup. How the mighty have fallen." Alistair slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was the voluntary surrender of her clinical privileges. "It's for the best. The Thorne name represents excellence. Your incident in the ore was a liability I couldn't ignore, even for a daughter." "The incident you staged, Alistair?" Julian asked, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were like shards of flint. Alistair's face didn't flicker. He leaned in, the scent of his expensive woodsy cologne, the kind that cost $400 a bottle, filling the space between them. "In this hospital, I am the truth. You are merely a footnote I'm choosing to erase." He turned to Dr. Reed. "Harrison, tell her what the board thinks of her future here." Dr. Harrison Reed cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably under Julian's steady stare. "The board supports the chief's decision, Julian." We need to maintain the hospital's reputation, especially with the gala in 48 hours. Julian picked up the fountain pen. The cold weight of the metal felt familiar, but she wasn't using it for surgery today. She was using it to sign a death warrant for their legacy. As she scrawled her name, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A haptic vibration, 3 short pulses. It was the signal from Sela's Vance. The final shares of the hospital's holding company had been moved into her offshore account. "There," Julian said, sliding the paper back. "I'm officially out of your sight." "And out of my will," Alistair added, his lip curling in a sneer of pure entitlement. He picked up the document as if it were a trophy. "Don't bother showing up at the house to collect your things. I've had them sent to a shelter. They seemed more suited for your current social standing." Marcus let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Maybe they'll give you a discount on a soup kitchen meal, Jules. You always were too smart for your own good. Now you're just another unemployed statistic with a famous last name you don't deserve." Julian stood up, smoothing the unbranded fabric of her blazer. She felt the weight of the encrypted tablet in her bag, the device that held the $40 million leverage she had spent 3 years building. She looked at Marcus's flushed, arrogant face and Alistair's cold, triumphant eyes. "The Thorne name is certainly going to be the talk of the gala," Julian said, her voice dropping an octave. She walked toward the door, stopping just beside her father. "I hope you enjoy the peak, Alistair. It's a long way down when the mountain starts to crumble." "Is that a threat?" Alistair barked, turning to face her. Julian smiled, a slow, chilling expression that didn't reach her eyes. "It's a forecast. Check the weather, father. A storm is coming in exactly 48 hours. She walked out before he could respond, the sound of her heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. As the elevator doors closed, she pulled out her phone and sent a 2-word message to Sela's, protocol blacklist. The countdown had moved from days to hours, and in the Thorne household, the lights were about to go out forever. The following morning, the glass-walled offices of Vance Thorne Technologies felt like a sanctuary compared to the suffocating opulence of her father's estate. Julianne Thorne stood before a wall of monitors, the low hum of cooling fans and the faint smell of ozone providing a rhythmic, mechanical comfort. She watched the lines of code scrolling in neon green, each string a tether she was preparing to cut. Sela's Vance sat at the main terminal, his fingers dancing across a haptic keyboard. He didn't look up when she approached, but his shoulders tightened. He was the only person who knew the true weight of the silent, $40 million leverage she carried in her pocket, a titanium-encased drive that held the digital ghosts of Alistair's secrets. "The encryption on the hospital's secondary server was pathetic," Sela said, his voice a low rasp. He finally looked at her, his eyes shadowed by dark circles. "Alistair Thorne thinks because he owns the building, he owns the data. He didn't even realize the surgical logs were being mirrored to a private cloud. Julian, if we push this live, there's no coming back. It won't just be a scandal. It'll be a funeral for the Thorne legacy." She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, smooth metal of the drive. The sensation was a grounding wire for the lightning of her rage. "The legacy died the moment he let Marcus scrub those mortality reports," she replied, her voice devoid of heat. "I didn't leave my residency because I couldn't handle the blood, Sela's. I left because I couldn't handle the lies. It's time the board sees what they're actually funding." 2 hours later, Julian navigated the sterile, white-tiled corridors of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. The scent of heavy antiseptic and floor wax clung to the air, a smell she had once associated with healing, but now recognized as the scent of a cover-up. She reached the executive wing, where the sound of her unbranded, high-tech boots was muffled by the thick, deep-pile carpet. She found Alistair in the VIP lounge, the clink of crystal against glass echoing in the quiet room. He was pouring a finger of vintage Scotch, the amber liquid catching the midday sun. Marcus was there too, leaning against a mahogany sideboard, looking every bit the pampered prince in a tailored lab coat that had likely never seen a drop of real work. "Back so soon?" Alistair asked without turning. He took a slow sip, the arrogance in his posture as rigid as his starched collar. I assumed you'd be halfway to the airport by now, Julian. Running away is what you do best, after all. Marcus chuckled, a sycophantic sound that grated against her nerves. Maybe she's here to ask for her old job back, Father. We might need someone to handle the paperwork in the basement. It's about the only thing she's qualified for since she couldn't cut it in the OR. Julian didn't flinch. She walked to the center of the room, her presence a sharp contrast to their performative luxury. I'm not here for a job, Marcus. I'm here to ensure the Board of Governors is fully prepared for the gala. It would be a shame if there were any technical difficulties during the presentation. Alistair finally turned, his eyes narrowing. He looked at her modest, dark clothing with a sneer that had been perfected over decades of looking down on anyone he couldn't buy. You always were dramatic. This storm you keep mentioning, it's a fantasy. I built this institution. My name is on the wing. You are a footnote that I've already erased. Is that what you told the families of the patients in the 402 wing? Julian asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to chill the room. The color in Alistair's face shifted, a subtle tightening of the jaw that only someone who had studied him for years would notice. He set the Scotch glass down with a sharp clack on the marble table. Don't test me, Julian. You have no standing here. You are a civilian playing at being a mogul. If you step foot in the boardroom tomorrow without an invitation, security will have you removed. Oh, I won't need to sneak in, she said, a small, cold smile playing on her lips. At that moment, the heavy oak doors opened, and Dr. Harrison Reed stepped in. The board chairman looked between them, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Alistair, we're ready for the final walkthrough. Julian, I didn't expect to see you here. I was just leaving, Dr. Reed, Julian said, her tone shifting to one of professional respect. I was just reminding my father that I'll be attending the dinner tomorrow as the primary donor for the new surgical robotics wing. I believe my firm's contribution was processed this morning. Alistair froze, the glass in his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. Marcus's smug expression vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated confusion. Vance Thorne is the anonymous donor. Harrison asked, his eyebrows rising in genuine surprise. Well, that changes the seating chart significantly. You'll be at the head table, Julian, right next to your father. Julian nodded, her gaze locking onto Alistair S. She could see the gears turning behind his eyes, the frantic realization that he had just insulted the woman who held the hospital's financial future in her hands. But he couldn't apologize, not in front of Harrison. His ego wouldn't allow the retreat. I look forward to it, Julian said. She turned to leave, the titanium drive in her pocket feeling heavier, like a loaded weapon. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. Enjoy the Scotch, Alistair. I hear the vintage is rare. It would be a pity to waste the last of it. She walked out before he could respond, the silence in the room behind her thick with the first real scent of fear. She had the evidence. She had the seat at the table. Now all she had to do was wait for the clock to strike 0. Exactly 48 hours remained, and the Thorne legacy was about to face its final, fatal audit. The following morning, the glass-walled sanctuary of the downtown loft felt less like an office and more like a bunker. Silas Vance sat hunched over a triple monitor setup, the blue light of the screens washing out his features. The air in the room was thick with the ozone smell of overworked cooling fans and the bitter, burnt scent of a third pot of espresso. Julianne Thorne watched the progress bar on the center screen, her reflection ghost-like against the scrolling lines of code. I've bridged the final gap, Silas said, his voice raspy from a night without sleep. He tapped a key with a flourish of finality. Alistair didn't just redirect the surgical grants. He funneled them through a shell company registered in the Caymans, then used that capital to buy out the medical patent for your neuromapping software. He's planning to announce it as a Thorne family innovation at the gala tomorrow night. Julian felt a cold, sharp prick of adrenaline. It wasn't just theft. It was an attempt to erase her entire professional existence. She touched the titanium drive in her pocket, the metal cool and grounding against her thumb. He thinks he can bury the architect and keep the blueprints, she murmured. Her phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. A text from Marcus Thorne appeared on the lock screen. Dad says don't bother showing up at the hospital today. We're doing the final walkthrough for the Reed wing. You'll just be in the way of the donors. Stay in your lane, Jules. The arrogance was a physical weight in the room. Julian didn't reply. Instead, she grabbed her coat, a charcoal wool wrap that cost more than Marcus's monthly car payment, though he'd never recognized the brand, and headed for the door. 24 hours, Silas, she said. The payload is ready, he replied, not looking up from the encryption keys. Just give the word. By noon, Julian stood in the soaring marble atrium of the Thorne Memorial Hospital. The scent of sterile antiseptic and expensive floor wax was a sensory trigger, a reminder of the years she had spent bleeding for a legacy that never intended to include her. In the center of the lobby, Alistair Thorne stood surrounded by a cluster of wealthy board members and Dr. Harrison Reed. Alistair was in his element, his tailored lab coat draped over his shoulders like a royal mantle. He was gesturing toward a digital rendering of the new surgical wing, his voice booming with the practiced warmth of a patriarch. As Julian approached, the group fell silent. Marcus, standing at his father's elbow, rolled his eyes. Alistair didn't even pause his narrative. He simply reached out and handed Julian his empty, dregs-stained coffee cup as she drew near, his eyes never leaving Dr. Reed's face. Be a dear and find a bin for that, Julian, Alistair said, his tone as casual as if he were speaking to a janitor. We're in the middle of a private tour for the stakeholders. The board members shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The disrespect was so casual, so ingrained, that it felt like a law of nature. Julian took the cup, her fingers steady. She didn't flush with anger. She didn't stammer. She simply looked Alistair in the eye, her gaze as cold as a surgical blade. You should be careful what you build on a hollow foundation, Alistair, she said, her voice quiet but carrying perfectly in the vaulted space. Alistair finally looked at her, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Still with the riddles? This is why you never cut it in the OR. Too much philosophy, not enough precision. Go home, you're clearly tired. I've never been more awake, she replied. She set the empty cup down on the edge of the expensive mahogany model of the new wing, right in the center of the proposed Thorne Innovation Center. Enjoy the walkthrough. I'm sure the donors will be fascinated by the history of the funding. She turned and walked away before he could respond. Behind her, she heard Marcus let out a sharp, derisive laugh. She's losing it, Dad. Totally delusional. Ignore her, Alistair's voice drifted back to her, dripping with dismissive pity. She's always been the weak link in the chain. Julian reached the glass exit doors, the winter air biting at her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk. She pulled out her phone and sent a single message to Silas. The audit begins at 8:00 p.m. tomorrow. Ensure the projection feed is hardwired. I want every donor in that room to see the exact moment the Thorne legacy turns to ash. She looked up at the hospital's name, glowing in gold letters against the gray sky. Tomorrow, those letters would mean something very different. She had the evidence. She had the leverage. And Alistair was so blinded by his own reflection that he hadn't even noticed the fuse was already lit. 20 hours remained. And Julianne Thorne was done being the ghost in his halls. The following evening, the Metropolitan Grand Ballroom was a cathedral of glass and ego. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the gold-leafed ceiling, casting a fractured light over the city's elite. Julianne Thorne stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her fingers grazing the cool marble railing. She wasn't wearing the family jewels or the heavy silks her mother had suggested. Instead, she wore a charcoal suit of unbranded high-tech fabric, matte, light-absorbent, and tailored with a precision that made the designer gowns below look like costumes. In her hidden interior pocket, the weight of a single encrypted drive pressed against her ribs. It was $40 million of leverage, and it was silent. Down on the main floor, Alistair Thorne was holding court. He looked every bit the patriarch in a tuxedo that probably cost more than a surgical resident's annual salary. He held a glass of vintage Scotch in one hand, gesturing expansively as a circle of donors hung on his every word. To anyone else, He was the visionary chief of surgery, the man whose name was synonymous with the hospital's prestige. To Julian, he was a man standing on a pedestal of sand, blissfully unaware of the tide coming in. "There she is!" a voice sneered behind her. She didn't have to turn to recognize the smell of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. Marcus moved into her peripheral vision, his face already flushed from the open bar. He leaned against the railing, looking her up and down with a derisive smirk. "Nice suit, Jules. Planning on fixing a server or just blending into the shadows? You look like the help," Marcus said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a nearby socialite. Julian didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her mineral water, the cold glass a sharp contrast to the heat of his arrogance. "The shadows are where the most interesting things happen, Marcus. You should try spending more time in them. You might learn something about how this hospital actually stays afloat." He let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Please, Dad's about to announce the new wing. Your little tech experiments are just a line item he's going to strike through next quarter. Enjoy the appetizers while you still have a badge." He reached out, flicking the lapel of her suit with 2 fingers. "Try not to embarrass us tonight. It's a big night for people who actually contribute." He pushed past her, heading toward the bar for a refill. Julian watched him go, her expression as unreadable as a blank screen. The rage spike was there, a familiar hum in her blood, but she channeled it into the countdown running in the back of her mind. 22 minutes until the audit presentation. She descended the grand staircase, her movements fluid and purposeful. The scent of lilies and expensive perfume was suffocating, a floral shroud over the rot she knew was hidden in the hospital's ledgers. As she reached the floor, she caught the eye of Alistair Thorne. Her mother was draped in emerald velvet, her face a mask of practiced grace, but her eyes were darting nervously toward Alistair. She looked like a woman who had spent 30 years watching for cracks in a dam. Julian gave her a single, sharp nod, a silent promise, before moving toward the tech alcove near the stage. Sila's Vance was already there, tucked behind a screen of decorative ferns. He was wearing a headset, his fingers dancing across a tablet. When he saw her, he didn't smile. Sila's didn't do smiles when he was in execution mode. "It is hardwired," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the string quartet playing Vivaldi. "The hospital's internal server thinks we're just running the Legacy of Excellence slideshow. But the moment you trigger the override from your watch, the audit files will bypass the local drive and pull directly from the cloud. They can't pull the plug once it starts. It's a ghost in the machine." "And the board?" Julian asked. "Dr. Harrison Reed is at table 4, Silas noted, nodding toward the front. "He's been looking at his watch every 30 seconds. He knows something is coming, even if he doesn't know what. He's ready to be the hero or the executioner. We just have to give him the axe." Julian felt a surge of cold satisfaction. "Stay on the line. I'm going to go say hello to the guest of honor." She moved through the crowd, a shadow cutting through the glitter. She found Alistair standing with Dr. Reed and several of the city's most powerful investors. Alistair's laughter boomed as she approached, his hand resting familiarly on Reed's shoulder. "Ah, Julian," Alistair said, his eyes narrowing as he took in her attire. The warmth in his voice didn't reach his gaze. "I was just telling Harrison that you've been working very hard on your little projects. It's good to see you taking an interest in the family business, even if your methods are a bit unconventional." "I think unconventional is exactly what the hospital needs right now, Alistair," Julian replied, her voice level. She turned to Dr. Harrison Reed. "Good evening, Doctor. I hope you're prepared for the presentation. It's going to be quite enlightening." Reed's eyes were sharp, searching hers. "I've been looking forward to it, Julian. Transparency is a rare commodity in this building lately." Alistair's jaw tightened, a micro-expression of irritation that only Julian was trained to see. He didn't like being sidelined in his own circle. "Transparency is my middle name, Harrison. That's why we're all here, to celebrate the Thorne legacy, a legacy built on trust." He turned back to Julian, his voice dropping to a low, warning hiss. "Go find your mother, Julian. The grown-ups are talking, and for God's sake, try to smile. You look like you're at a funeral." "Maybe I am," she said softly, her eyes locking onto his. Alistair dismissed her with a wave of his hand, turning back to his donors. He was so certain of his power, so insulated by his own reflection, that he didn't see the predator standing right in front of him. The lights in the ballroom suddenly dimmed, a signal that the formal program was beginning. A spotlight hit the podium on the stage, where a massive projection screen hung blank and expectant. The room fell into a hushed, anticipatory silence. Alistair stepped away from his group, adjusting his cuffs. He looked at Julian one last time, a smirk of pure, condescending triumph on his face. "Watch and learn, Julian. This is how you lead." He began his walk toward the stage, the applause starting low and building into a roar. Julian stayed in the shadows by the mezzanine stairs, her thumb hovering over the face of her watch. She could feel the pulse of the room, the collective breath held in anticipation of another year of Thorne dominance. Alistair reached the podium and gripped the sides, leaning into the microphone. He looked out at the sea of wealth and influence, his face glowing with the pride of a king. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alistair began, his voice echoing with practiced authority. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate a hospital, we celebrate a promise. A promise that the Thorne name will always stand for the highest standard of integrity." Julian looked at her watch. 7:59 p.m. She felt the weight of the drive in her pocket, the silent leverage ready to speak. She didn't look at the stage. She looked at the exit, knowing that in 60 seconds the man at the podium would be a ghost. She pressed the trigger. The screen behind Alistair flickered once, then went dark. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Alistair paused, frowning over his shoulder. "Just a technical glitch," he said, his smile wavering but holding. "As I was saying," the screen didn't show the Thorne Memorial logo. It showed a spreadsheet, a single-line item highlighted in blood red. Julian turned and began to walk toward the doors, her heels silent on the plush carpet. She didn't need to see the rest. The fuse was gone. The explosion was just beginning. The silence in the grand ballroom was a physical weight, heavier than the crystal chandeliers shimmering overhead. Julianne Thorne stopped 3 paces from the heavy oak exit, her back to the stage. She didn't need to turn around to feel the oxygen leave the room. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the projector and the sharp, jagged intake of breath from the front row. On the massive screen, the spreadsheet didn't just show numbers. It showed a roadmap of a decade of systematic theft. A $40 million deficit in the surgical wing expansion fund was traced, in blindingly clear red ink, to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. The primary signatory's name was highlighted in a bold, unforgiving font, Alistair Thorne. Alistair stood frozen at the podium, the microphone emitting a faint, high-pitched whine that set Julian's teeth on edge. His face underwent a violent, public transformation. The ruddy, self-assured glow of a man who believed himself untouchable evaporated in a heartbeat. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the burst capillaries on his cheeks stand out like jagged red lightning. His mouth hung open, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrolled twitch that made his perfectly groomed beard look absurdly fragile. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, darted frantically from the spreadsheet to the faces of the board members, widening until the whites were visible all around the irises. He looked less like a chief of surgery and more like a cornered animal realizing the cage door had been welded shut. This is a malicious fabrication," Alistair finally barked, though his voice cracked, losing its baritone authority. He slammed a fist onto the lectern, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Security, shut that off, it's a hack, a common, desperate hack." Marcus Thorne scrambled toward the tech booth, his face flushed with a mixture of panic and inherited arrogance. "You heard him, turn it off now." He shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the young technician who was staring, mesmerized, at the screen. Julian finally turned. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The scent of expensive lilies from the floral arrangement seemed to sharpen in the sudden chill of the room. She walked back toward the stage, her heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm against the marble floor. Every head in the room, the city's elite, the donors, the press, swiveled to follow her. Dr. Harrison Reed, the board chairman, stood up from the center table. He adjusted his glasses, his expression one of profound, icy realization. He didn't look at the screen anymore, he looked at Alistair. Beside him, Alistair Thorne sat perfectly still, her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes brimming with a terrifying clarity. 2 other board members were already on their phones, their voices hushed but urgent, likely calling legal counsel. "It's not a hack, Alistair," Julianne said, her voice cutting through the rising murmurs like a scalpel. She reached the base of the stage and looked up at him. She felt the cold weight of the original bank ledgers in her mind, the digital trails Silas Vance had spent months unmasking. "Those are the internal audit logs from the Thorne Family Trust, the ones you thought you'd scrubbed when you fired the previous controller." "You did this," Alistair hissed, leaning over the podium, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood. "You ungrateful, pathetic little. I didn't do anything but stop lying for you," she interrupted, her tone devoid of heat. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, unbranded remote. With a single click, the screen shifted. It wasn't a spreadsheet anymore. It was a scanned copy of the resignation Alistair had forced her to sign years ago, side by side with the offshore wire transfer he'd authorized that same afternoon. The room erupted. Dr. Harrison Reed stepped toward the stage, his voice booming. "Alistair, step away from the podium. Now." Alistair looked at the board, then at the cameras, and finally back at his daughter. The realization that his legacy was not just tarnished, but incinerated, seemed to hit him all at once. He slumped, the tailored lab coat suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for him. Julianne met his gaze one last time, her expression as stoic as the day he'd cast her out. "You told me I didn't belong in this family because I wouldn't protect the name," she said, loud enough for the front 3 rows to hear. "But you're the one who destroyed it. I just turned on the lights." She turned her back on him before he could respond, walking away as the first of the security guards approached the stage, not to help Alistair, but to escort him. She didn't look back at Marcus's frantic shouting or her mother's tears. She walked out of the ballroom, the silence behind her replaced by the roar of a collapsing empire. The silence in the marble-floored foyer was a physical weight, pressing against the ears of everyone who had fled the ballroom in Julianne Thorne's wake. Seconds after the heavy oak doors latched shut, the muffled roar of 500 confused socialites began to bleed through the wood. But out here, the air was cold and smelled of floor wax and expensive, panicked sweat. Alistair Thorne didn't walk out of the room. He was practically carried, his arms gripped by 2 stone-faced security guards. His face didn't just pale. It seemed to physically erode under the harsh overhead LEDs. The ruddy, Scotch-tinted confidence had been hollowed out, leaving behind a gray, translucent mask of sheer terror. His eyes, usually sharp with the practiced condescension of a man who played God in the operating theater, darted wildly, unable to find a single friendly face to latch onto. His lower lip bore a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that betrayed the violent collapse of his composure. The skin around his jaw sagged, the muscles that had held a smirk for decades finally surrendering, making him look 20 years older in the span of a single heartbeat. His tailored lab coat, once a symbol of absolute authority, now hung limp and stained with the perspiration of a man who realized the floor had finally vanished beneath him. "This is a mistake," he wheezed as the guards paused near the exit. He looked at Julianne, his voice cracking into a high, thin reed. "Julianne, tell them you're just hurt. Tell them the documents are a misunderstanding." Julianne stood near the grand staircase, her unbranded tech fabric blazer sharp against the ornate backdrop. She didn't move. She didn't even flinch. She simply watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. "The only mistake, Alistair, was thinking I was still the girl who would protect your secrets to keep the family whole," she said, her voice echoing off the marble. "The family was never whole. It was just a collection of people you used as scaffolding for your ego." The doors behind them swung open again, and Marcus Thorne stumbled out, his face flushed a frantic shade of crimson. He looked at his father, then at the guards, and then at Julianne. The enabler's instinct to protect the source of his lifestyle fought a brief, losing battle with the instinct for self-preservation. "I had no idea," Marcus blurted out, his hands raised as if to ward off an invisible blow. He stepped away from Alistair, physically distancing himself by several feet. "Julian, I swear to you, I didn't know he was diverting the research funds into the offshore accounts. I just signed what he told me to sign. I'm a victim here, too." The betrayal was so swift it seemed to steal the remaining air from Alistair's lungs. He turned a devastated look toward his son, but Marcus wouldn't meet his gaze. Marcus was already looking at Julian with a sickeningly hopeful expression, the look of a stray dog searching for a new master. "You were his right hand, Marcus," Julian said, her tone devoid of anger, which made it far more terrifying. "If you didn't know, it's because you were too busy spending the dividends of his theft to care where they came from." Dr. Harrison Reed stepped out from the ballroom last, holding a tablet that glowed with the digital evidence Silas Vance had finished uploading to the hospital's main server. The board chairman looked at Alistair, not with the warmth of their long-standing golf games, but with the cold efficiency of a man protecting a billion-dollar asset. "The authorities are waiting in the security office, Alistair," Dr. Harrison Reed said, his voice dropping like a gavel. "The board has already voted. Your license is suspended pending a full criminal investigation, and your name is being stripped from the wing before the sun comes up tomorrow. We're done." Alistair Thorne appeared in the doorway then, silent and ghost-like. She didn't cry. She didn't rush to her husband's side. She watched as the guards began to lead Alistair toward the side exit, his heels clicking hollowly against the stone. When Alistair reached out a trembling hand toward her, a silent plea for the woman who had spent 30 years in his shadow, she simply adjusted her shawl and looked at the floor. The silence of her refusal was the loudest sound in the room. "You said I didn't belong in this family," Julian said, her voice catching Alistair one last time before he disappeared into the hallway. "And you were right. I belong to the future. You belong to the archives." She turned her back on the wreckage of the Thorne legacy, her heels making a steady, rhythmic sound as she walked toward the main entrance. Silas was already there, holding the door open, the cool night air rushing in to replace the stagnant scent of the ballroom. Marcus scrambled after her, desperate. "Julian, we need to talk about the transition. If you're the majority shareholder now, we need to discuss my role." She stopped at the threshold, the city lights reflecting in her calm, dark eyes. "Your role, Marcus, is to find a lawyer. I'd suggest a cheap one. You're going to need the rest of your money for the civil suits." She stepped out into the night without looking back. Behind her, the heavy doors clicked shut, leaving Alistair Thorne alone in a windowless room with the police, and Marcus Thorne standing in a foyer that no longer belonged to him. Julian took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, the weight of the $40 million leverage finally feeling like what it was. Not a weapon, but a key to a door she had finally walked through. Alistair sat in the back of a black sedan 10 minutes later, his hands cuffed, watching the hospital's glowing sign disappear in the distance. For the first time in his life, the great Alistair Thorne was in a room where no one cared about his name, and the only sound was the clicking of a digital clock, counting down the seconds of a life that had ended while he was still breathing. 6 months later, the glass-walled office of Vance Thorne Technologies smelled of ozone and expensive espresso, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic scent of the life Julianne Thorne had left behind. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city below. The morning fog was lifting, revealing the skyline where the Thorne Medical sign had once dominated the horizon. Now it was gone, replaced by the sleek, minimalist logo of the Reed Vance Research Institute. Silas Vance leaned against the mahogany desk, tapping a tablet. He looked younger without the shadow of Alistair's legal threats hanging over him. He cleared his throat, sliding a digital contract across the surface. "It's done. The final assets of the Thorne estate have been liquidated. The creditors are satisfied, and the remaining funds have been moved into the Foundation for Resident Mental Health." She didn't turn around immediately. She felt the cool, brushed metal of her unbranded watch against her wrist, a gift to herself that cost more than her father's vintage Scotch collection, though no one would know it by looking. "And the house?" she asked. "Sold," he replied, "to a historical preservation society. They're turning the foyer where Marcus used to hold court into a public gallery." A small, cold smile touched her lips. She thought of Marcus Thorne. 2 weeks ago, he'd had the audacity to call her from a prepaid phone, his voice shaking as he begged for a consultant position at her new firm. He'd actually suggested that his name still carried weight in the industry, oblivious to the fact that his reputation was radioactive. She had listened for exactly 10 seconds before hanging up. He was currently living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, working as a pharmaceutical sales rep for a mid-tier company that didn't care about his pedigree. The Thorne name was no longer a golden ticket, it was a lead weight. The fall of Alistair Thorne had been even more absolute. Stripped of his medical license and facing a decade of litigation for insurance fraud and surgical negligence, the former chief of surgery was a ghost of a man. Julian had seen a photo of him in the morning papers during the preliminary hearings. His tailored lab coats had been replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting suit, and his skin looked like gray parchment. He no longer commanded the room. He shrank from the cameras, a broken patriarch whose legacy had been dismantled brick by the daughter he dismissed as a sleeping lion. "Dr. Harrison Reed called this morning," Silas added, snapping her back to the present. "He wanted to personally thank you. The hospital's mortality rates have dropped 12% since the culture of fear was dismantled. He said the board is finally breathing again." "Good," she said, finally turning to face him. She picked up a pen and signed the final document. With that single stroke, the Thorne Medical Group officially ceased to exist. Later that afternoon, she met Alistair Thorne for tea in a quiet garden cafe far from the prying eyes of their old social circle. Her mother looked different, softer, her eyes no longer darting to the door in anticipation of a husband's criticism. She was living in a small, sun-drenched cottage by the coast, spending her days painting landscapes instead of managing a household of secrets. "He asks about you," Alistair said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her porcelain cup. "Your father. He wants to know if you'll visit him before the sentencing." Julian watched a sparrow land on a nearby stone fountain. The sound of the splashing water was peaceful, yet the silence between them was heavy with the things they could never fix. "I have nothing left to say to him, Mother. Everything I wanted him to know is in the court records." Alistair nodded slowly, a look of profound sadness crossing her face. "I know, I wonder if it was worth it. The silence in the house is so loud sometimes." "The silence is just peace," she replied, reaching across the table to squeeze her mother's hand. "You just aren't used to it yet." She walked to her car 10 minutes later, the crisp autumn air catching in her lungs. She had won. She had her company, her reputation, and the satisfaction of seeing the truth carved into the history of the city. But as she sat in the driver's seat of her silent electric sedan, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. There was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, a coldness she'd inherited from the very man she'd destroyed. She started the car and pulled away from the curb. Behind her, the cafe faded into the distance, and ahead lay the glittering glass tower of her new empire. She had built a dynasty of her own, but as she looked at the empty passenger seat, she realized the price of the crown. The sleeping lion had woken up, but the family she had once hoped to save had been the first thing she'd had to burn to the ground to stay warm.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.